So the question's been posed, how do I get to gray from complementary, fully saturated hues? How do I recognize what gray is? And so I think that's the gist of the question. So I'm going to do a little kind of exercise or demo here in Photoshop, basically picking up on the swatch palette and showing you a way to start understanding visually. And you can do this visual exercise as well with each of the complementary hue pairs. So what I'm going to do is I've selected over here a violet. And to my eye, just looking at things on my display, this violet, which is actually this one right here, is neither too red nor too blue. Remember, violet, the secondary in the subtractive system, is made up of red and blue. And it is fully saturated. So what I want to do is look for a representation of violet that's going to be fully saturated in the swatch panel here. And so I picked that. Okay, so I've selected my color, and now I have this bounding box, as you see, and I'm going to go to layers. And so that bounding box is on the background layer, and the background layer is filled with white. Well, what I want to do is create a new background layer, and since that's active, the bounding box is going to associate and activate on the active layer. It's not going to activate on the background. And that means that that's going to remain even if I turn the background to invisible. But we'll keep the white background for now. And I'm going to pick up that violet, which is over here in the color picker. We can actually see what that is. We've got the RGB notation and the CMYK notation. And it's kind of looking neither too red nor too blue to my eye. So I'm going to hit OK. And I want to make sure I'm going to fill this with a gradient fill. And want to make sure that the opacity is set to 100%, and I've got the gradient going from 100% to clear. So here are all your gradient possibilities, so that's just basically what I want. I don't want it going to another color. And so I will start over here on the left with violet, and remember that I am in the active layer is the new layer, it's not the background layer. So the white will be underneath what I'm doing. So I'm going to hit Shift. I'm going to hold down the Shift key on a Mac while I'm doing this, and I'm going to set my cursor and just drag the gradient tool all the way across, get to the other edge, and lift, and there you go. So now what we have is fully saturated violet over here. And no hue, no color, no chroma, no nothing over here. If I turn the background layer off, obviously, you can see how there's a transparency. It's opaque here and then starts to get increasingly transparent as we go across. Turn the background layer back on, and looking at this, I'm going to go to a new layer. So I just made layer 2. And now I'm going to turn layer 1 off. That's the violet. So what's the complement of violet? It's yellow in the subtractive. So I'm going to go search for a yellow over here. And what I want is a yellow that is neither warm nor cool, but fully saturated. Are we looking pretty good there? Let's go over and check what that is. 255, 225. Yeah, we can probably leave it there. Let's take that out, and let's take that out. So that changes the RGB components as well. So you can see that the original yellow looked a little bit redder and dirtier, and this one looks a little more balanced. It's not as warm, and it's because it has less red, it is also lighter in value. So I'll hit OK. Now this time I'm going to go from the right to the left with the fill. I'm going to pick up the gradient tool, make sure that the opacity is 100%, and you can see here that we're now working with yellow instead of violet. So I'm going to start over here and set my cursor and hold down the Shift because I'm on a Mac and just draw it straight across, and there you go. So because it's going from full saturation to clear, now when I activate the violet layer, we can see that there is now a blend, a gradient of color. So we've created our own gradient without using the gradient map tool, and we've just used a couple layers. So the question is, where is gray? Because we know it's somewhere here in the middle. Yellow is fully saturated over here on the right. Violet's fully saturated over here on the left. Somewhere in the middle, it starts going gray. We can see the neutralization of the chroma by the yellow as we move toward the center. And we can see the neutralization of the yellow by the violet as we move away from the right edge toward the center. So where exactly is gray in this? So that's kind of 50%. And that gives us this really funky avocado looking color. So that's not it. And the reason I know that that's not it is I'll go back to the background layer and I'm just going to do we'll just do circle fills. Remember, this is all to help you identify what gray looks like, to understand what a neutral gray, an achromatic gray, looks like. So here on your color palette, the basic palette that comes with Photoshop, there's all of these, what we'd call spot color in subtractive. And you can pick any one of those, but there's a lot of grays, and there's a lot of reds and yellows and violets and so forth. So what exactly is gray? Well, we know that these are exactly achromatic. So I'm going to grab that, and I'm going to paint bucket fill into there. What we actually want to see is something similar to this somewhere in here, and we're not quite getting it. Well, why aren't we quite getting it? Because there's probably going to be too much red in this, because it's kind of going brownish. It's got some warmth to it in here. And we'll just copy. So what I'm doing on the Mac is I'm just holding down the Option key and which gives me the ability to copy things. What I'm going to do is come over here and I'm going to hit Command E or merge down to just merge those two layers into one. And I'm going to eyedrop. So what we'd like to see visually is that this gray is smack dab in the center. So by looking at the gray circle, we can see that everything in this bar has chroma. So we haven't achieved with this yellow and this violet, we have not achieved that neutral gray. And that's the tricky thing, especially if you're mixing subtractively. It's not a 50-50 proportion or equal proportion of, say, red to green to get to the gray, because of different wavelengths. Even reflected light from pigmented surfaces is a wavelength issue. So whether you're in additive or subtractive, you do have to eyeball a lot. You do have to estimate. What we want to do is go from fully saturated hue to gray to fully saturated hue. And everything in between this and this, and everything in between this over here and the middle gray, is going to be a chromatic neutral because there will be chroma to it. So only the gray, the thing without the chroma, is the true neutral. And unfortunately, there's nothing there on this bar. So I'm actually going to back up, go back beyond the merge down. And the reason I'm going to do that is I'm going to try picking a cooler violet. So if I go to my swatches, that's the violet I had. And so now we'll look at it over here in the color field picker. And it's got a decent amount of red. But what if I did, say, 85 cyan? And then I did an equal amount of 85 magenta. Whoops, that didn't work. Interesting color, but that's not what we want. There we go. So that's going to give us this, and it doesn't seem to be as saturated as this. So I'm going to adjust it down. Until I can't see a difference. There's very little demarcation between the two colors. The reason I'm doing that is that I know that in the subtractive, the violet is the darkest of the hues. The normal or inherent value of violet is the darkest of the hues. So I'm eyeballing, I'm estimating, if you will. And so now I'm going to choose that color, which we see over here, and I'm going to face it off against the yellow. So I'll go back to layers, and I'm going to take this, and I will hide that. And then first thing I need to do is empty out that violet. So I'm going to select beyond it and do a command, or it's a Shift Command I, or invert. So you can go up to select and then invert. Basically that selects what wasn't selected before, and I'm going to delete it. Now I'm going to go in with the new color and the gradient, holding down the Shift key again. There we go. So now we have violet and nothing over here because it's clear, and we can check that out because we see the grid, the structural grid behind it. So now where are we? Now I've still got the totally achromatic gray. And we can see that as it moves toward the fully chromatic, fully saturated yellow, it appears darker, which is the value contrast. That's a relative value. But we see that the yellow kind of pops forward. It kind of starts attracting the eye and overtaking the gray. So as I move this down range from the yellow toward the violet, you can see that it's entering sort of a gray area, and it's actually becoming more like the background. It's just darker than the background. If I were to fill this with a lighter gray, you can see that we're starting to get fairly gray. So again, it's still the violet that needs probably more blue to actually look achromatic. But the thing is, the whole point of this is that if you look at this, there's no chroma here. Everything around it is chroma, even though the value of things is pretty much the same. There's no chroma here, but we can see that there's chroma here. So the idea is for you to compare what the gray looks like, the achromatic, versus the chromatic. So we're pretty close to gray here. There's just a little bit of chroma, and it's probably just a very thin band of gray, which makes it a little bit difficult to see because it's not very wide. So this is what gray looks like. This is what chroma looks like. You can do this with subtractive color fairly easily, either by mixing color yourself, and first of all mixing a gray with a mixture of black and white, and then highly chromatic colors or somewhat chromatic colors. Another way you can do this is actually just studying your Pantone swatch books. If you have a set of Pantone or the Pantone app, or even again just opening up a swatch panel like over here and noticing where things are more chromatic, where they're less chromatic, just kind of comparing and contrasting the relationships of colors. So for instance, right down here in this area, we have a variety of grays, and we've got some reddish grays and some bluish grays. There's some grays with some yellow, and there's some grays with very little bit of orange. We're going here from more chromatic to less chromatic. We're going from more chromatic, high chroma, to low chroma, high saturation to low saturation. In this case, also darker in value to lighter in value. These are all very similar in value. They change in chroma, but they don't really change in value as much. So just by studying, looking, observing, thinking, observing carefully, paying attention to what it is you're seeing, you're going to be training your eye to see differences in levels of chroma, levels of value, and levels of saturation. Again, those are the three properties of subtractive color: hue, value, intensity. Hue is chroma, value, of course, is value, and then intensity is your saturation level. and they correspond to the additive hue, luminance, and saturation. So I hope this was helpful. Leave me questions or comments if you need further assistance.